Imagine participating in a wedding where the honor of the entire family is at stake, and where the most decisive moment happens far from everyone's eyes. In biblical times, marriage was not merely about love or celebration. It was covenant, tradition, and a silent proof that could change destinies forever. Many know the romantic stories of the Bible, but almost no one speaks about what truly happened when the feast ended and the wedding night began. Today you will discover forgotten customs, historical truths, and details that are rarely explained. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and leave your like, so as not to miss the next biblical stories that reveal what few tell. Stay until the end, because a single revelation can completely transform the way you understand biblical marriages. How marriage was in biblical times. The truth about the wedding night that no one mentions. You were never asked for your hand in marriage, at least not in the way you imagine. 3,000 years ago, no man knelt with a ring. No woman said yes with tears in her eyes. Marriage did not begin with love. It began with a negotiation between two fathers, a signed contract, and a price paid in silver. And the bride? Often she only knew her husband's face on the night she had to share a bed with him. This is the reality that no one tells when speaking of biblical marriage. A reality where romance was a luxury, personal choice was an exception, and the destiny of a young woman was decided before she could even offer an opinion. Not out of cruelty, but because in that society, marriage was not about feelings. It was about survival, honor, and continuity of lineage. Consider the scenario. You are a young woman of 14 or 15 years living in a village in ancient Judea. Your routine involves fetching water from the well, grinding grain, caring for younger siblings, and learning from your mother the secrets of keeping a household running. One day your father arrives with news. A man from a neighboring family has shown interest. Negotiations will begin. You are not consulted. From that moment on, your future depends on a conversation between two older men sitting in the shade of a fig tree discussing values, lands, and commitments. Biblical marriage was, above all, a commercial and social agreement. This does not mean that love did not exist. It means it was not a prerequisite. It was an expected consequence, something that should grow afterward, not before. The first step of this process had a specific name. It was called the choosing of the bride. In most cases, parents made this selection considering practical factors. Was the family respectable? Did the young woman have a good reputation? Was there compatibility between the tribes? Did the financial situation allow for the agreement? These were objective questions, not romantic ones. Genesis records one of the most detailed examples of this process. When Abraham decided it was time for his son Isaac to marry, he did not let the young man choose. The patriarch was 140 years old. His wife Sarah had recently died. Isaac, already 40 years old, remained single. In any other family of the region, this would be a scandal. A man of this age without a wife and without children represented social failure. But Abraham had a specific concern. He did not want his son to marry Canaanite women, not out of ethnic prejudice, out of a matter of faith. The peoples of Canaan worshipped other gods, practicing rituals that the covenant with the Lord forbade. Such a marriage could lead Isaac away from the path that God had traced for his descendants. So Abraham called Eliezer, the oldest servant of his house, administrator of all he possessed. He made the man swear with his hand under his thigh, a gesture that indicated a solemn oath involving progeny. The mission was clear. Travel more than 800 kilometers to Mesopotamia, the land of Abraham's origin, and find a suitable wife among his relatives. Not the most beautiful, not the most passionate, the most suitable for the covenant that God had established. Eliezer arrived at the well of Nahor at evening, exactly at the time when the women came to fetch water. He made a specific prayer. He asked for a sign. The young woman who offered water to him and also to his 10 camels would be the chosen one. Consider the weight of this test. A thirsty camel can drink up to 130 liters of water at once. 10 camels potentially meant more than 1,000 liters. Each trip to the well with a clay jar carried at most 20 liters. We are talking about 50 or 60 trips to the well under the desert sun. Rebecca appeared. Without knowing she was being observed, she offered water to the stranger, and then said the exact words Eliezer expected. "I will also draw water for your camels." The servant remained silent, watching. The young woman worked until all the animals were satisfied. That was not just hospitality, it was a demonstration of character, a willingness for hard work, and a generosity that exceeded expectations. That same night, Eliezer went to the house of Bethuel, Rebekah's father. Gifts were offered. Gold jewelry weighing about half a kilogram was placed in the hands of the family. The proposal was presented. And then came the question that would define everything. Will you give the girl? Laban and Bethuel answered together. This comes from the Lord. We cannot say either yes or no. Rebekah is before you. Take her. Observe that Rebekah was only consulted afterward, and even then, the question was not whether she wanted to marry Isaac. It was whether she was willing to depart immediately or preferred to stay 10 more days. The major decision had already been made by others. This may seem oppressive by modern standards. But within that culture, it functioned as a protection system. A young woman alone had no way to evaluate if a suitor would fulfill his promises. The father, with experience and a network of contacts, could investigate the reputation of the groom's family, verify his ability to provide, and ensure fair terms in the matrimonial contract. And contract was the key word. Unlike what many imagine, marriage in the biblical world was not just a religious ceremony, it was a legal document. Archaeologists have found hundreds of matrimonial contracts from the ancient Near East, some dating back more than 4,000 years. These documents specified the obligations of both parties, conditions for divorce, rights over properties, and even penalties for non-compliance. The central element of these negotiations was the mohar. This Hebrew word is usually translated as dowry or bride price, but no translation completely captures its meaning. The mohar was not a payment as if the woman were merchandise. It was compensation to her family for the loss of a worker and also a guarantee that the groom took the commitment seriously. Think of the economic logic. A daughter represented years of investment, food, clothing, training in domestic skills. When she married, all that productive capacity was transferred to another family. The mohar balanced this equation. It was recognition of the value the young woman would add to her new home. Values varied according to social position. Common families negotiated modest amounts, perhaps equivalent to a few months' work. Wealthier families dealt with significant values in silver, gold, or flocks. For the daughters of kings, the numbers could be astronomical. The value varied enormously. When Jacob wanted to marry Rachel, he had no resources to pay a traditional mohar. He had fled his father's house after stealing Esau's blessing. He arrived at the house of Laban, his uncle, literally with nothing but the clothes on his back. How to pay for a bride in these conditions? So he offered something different. 7 years of labor. Think of the weight of this proposal. 7 years waking before the sun rose. 7 years tending flocks in the cold of winter and the scorching heat of summer. 7 years enduring Laban's manipulations. 7 years away from his family of origin, all for one woman. Genesis describes that these years seemed but a few days for the love he had for her. It is one of the most romantic phrases in the entire Bible, and it shows that love could exist even within an apparently cold system. Jacob was not forced to love Rachel. He simply loved her, and that love transformed years of heavy labor into time that flew by, 7 whole years. When finally the term ended, Jacob went to Laban. "My time is fulfilled. Give me my wife that I may go in unto her." The banquet was prepared. Night arrived. The veiled bride was conducted to the dark room, and in the morning Jacob discovered he had consummated marriage with the wrong sister, Leah, not Rachel. Laban's trickery revealed the shadows of the system, the heavy veil, the darkness of the room, the tradition of silence during the first night. All this allowed the switch. Jacob protested, but Laban had a ready answer. "It is not the custom in our land to give the younger before the firstborn. If he wanted Rachel, he would need to work 7 more years, 14 years in total, for love. But the mohar could take other forms. When Saul wanted to hinder David's marriage to his daughter Michal, he demanded a makab. Price, 100 foreskins of the Philistines. It was a death sentence disguised as a matrimonial proposal. Saul calculated that David would die trying to fulfill the requirement. The young shepherd surprised everyone. He returned with 200. In addition to the mohar, there was another financial component called matan. These were gifts given directly to the bride, not to her family. Jewelry, clothing, valuables that would become the woman's personal property. This detail matters because it created a kind of financial security. If the marriage ended through the husband's fault, the wife would take the matan with her. The third element was the shiluhim, the gifts that the bride's family sent with her to the new home. They could include female servants, flocks, domestic utensils, and lands. When Rebekah departed to meet Isaac, her family sent along her nurse and other servants. Caleb promised to give his daughter Aksa, along with springs of water as shiluhim, recognizing that land without water had no value in that arid region. What would it be like to participate in these negotiations? As a young bride, you likely heard fragments of conversations, saw the movement of gifts, perceived the tension in your mother's eyes. But the details were resolved between men. Your role was to wait. When negotiations reached a satisfactory agreement, something happened that changed everything. The couple entered a stage called kiddushin, often translated as betrothal or engagement, but these modern words do not capture the seriousness of what it meant. The kiddushin was legally binding. From that moment on, the young woman was considered the groom's wife before the law. They did not live together yet, they had no physical intimacy. They did not share meals or domestic space. But the bond was so real that breaking it required a formal divorce. If the groom died during this period, the young woman was considered a widow with all the rights and limitations that implied. If she became involved with another man, she was treated as an adulteress, with all the severe consequences the law determined. This distinction confuses modern readers. For us, engagement is a serious but reversible commitment. A couple can undo an engagement without a legal process. A difficult conversation and the return of the ring suffice. In the biblical world, the kiddushin created a legal reality that only ended by death or a formal document of divorce. Matthew records exactly this situation. Mary was betrothed to Joseph when she discovered she was pregnant by the Holy Spirit. Imagine her position. A virgin, promised to a righteous man, carrying a child that was not his. How to explain? Who would believe? Joseph, not knowing the divine origin of the child, considered leaving her secretly. The text uses the word divorce, not ending a courtship, not cancelling a commitment. Divorce, because the kiddushin already made them husband and wife in legal terms, even without consummation, even without cohabitation, even without Joseph ever having touched Mary. This period of betrothal generally lasted 12 months for a virgin and 1 month for a widow. The time was not arbitrary. It served for the groom to prepare everything to receive his wife. In practice, this meant building or renovating quarters. Measure this task. A typical young Jew still lived in his father's house. When he married, he did not leave to build his own residence. He added new rooms to the existing structure. It was heavy manual labor, cutting stones, preparing mortar, raising walls, installing doors. All this while continuing his regular work obligations in the field or the family workshop. Jesus used exactly this image to explain his departure. In my Father's house are many mansions. I go to prepare a place for you. It was the language of marriage. The disciples understood immediately. The master was saying he was departing like a groom who goes to prepare the home but would return to fetch his bride. While the groom worked on the construction, the bride also had her responsibilities. She gathered her trousseau, prepared clothes, learned recipes and domestic techniques. But above all, she waited, and this waiting had a distressing characteristic. She did not know exactly when the groom would come to fetch her. Tradition said that the groom's father was the one who decided when the preparations were complete. It could be in 10 months. It could be in 15. The groom worked, the father inspected, and only when the elder declared that everything was ready could the marriage happen. The parable of the 10 virgins gains new meaning with this context. 5 were prudent and kept extra oil for their lamps. 5 were careless and did not prepare for the delay. When finally the cry echoed at midnight, announcing the arrival of the groom, half were not ready. These were not rules invented to tell a story. It was an exact description of how marriages functioned. When the father finally approved the preparations, the celebration began. And what a celebration! The groom gathered his closest friends, called the sons of the bride chamber, or companions of the groom. John the Baptist used this expression to describe his relationship with Jesus. These men had a specific role: to accompany the groom in the procession, ensure the feast went well, and witness the legitimacy of the union. It was a considerable honor to be chosen for this function. The groom wore his best clothes, fabrics dyed in vibrant colors, perhaps embroidered with gold threads if the family had resources. In some cases, he even wore a crown or a garland of flowers, a symbol of joy and temporary royalty. On that night, he was the king of his own celebration. The procession departed at nightfall, carrying torches and making music through the streets of the village. Flutes, drums, cymbals created a festive melody. Voices sang traditional wedding songs. It was impossible not to notice. The sound announced to everyone, "Tonight there is a wedding." Neighbors came to their doors to bless them. Children ran behind the cortege. Even those who had not been invited participated in the moment from a distance. The group arrived at the bride's house, who was also dressed in her best attire. A veil covering her face, jewelry borrowed from friends and relatives, clothes dyed with vibrant colors. She was escorted out by her companions, and then the combined procession followed to the groom's house. Visualize this scene: narrow streets of an ancient village, stone and mud walls echoing music, torches creating dancing shadows, an entire community participating in the most important moment in the lives of two families, children running alongside the cortege, elders blessing from their doors, the air heavy with expectation and joy. The arrival at the groom's house marked the beginning of the banquet. And when we say banquet, we are not talking about a 3-hour reception with dinner and cake. Biblical weddings lasted days. 7 days was the standard mentioned in various texts. Samson offered a 7-day banquet when he married the Philistine woman of Timnah. Laban insisted that Jacob fulfill the bridal week with Leah before receiving Rachel. Tobias, in the Deuterocanonical book that bears his name, celebrated 14 days of feasting. During this period, food and drink flowed constantly. Wine was essential, so essential that running out of it represented a grave humiliation for the host family. It was exactly this crisis that created the setting for Jesus' first miracle. In Cana of Galilee, on the 3rd day of a wedding celebration, the wine ran out. Mary noticed the problem and brought it to Jesus. The result was 6 stone jars, each holding between 80 and 120 liters, filled with water transformed into the best wine the guests had ever tasted. 400 to 700 liters of wine, all at once. This reveals the scale of these celebrations. Dozens or hundreds of guests, eating and drinking for consecutive days, required impressive logistics. Sheep were slaughtered, bread baked in industrial quantities, fruits and dates piled high, cheeses prepared. It was the most significant social event many villages saw during the entire year. But while the feast happened outside, another moment approached, the most intimate, the most charged with meaning and pressure. The wedding night. This moment was called in Hebrew to go in unto the bride. Biblical language consistently uses this expression to describe the consummation of marriage. Abraham went in unto Hagar, Jacob went in unto Leah, Boaz went in unto Ruth. The verb carried legal meaning beyond the physical. Entering marked the definitive transition. Consider what this young bride faced. She had been prepared for years for this moment, but theoretical preparation does not eliminate nervousness. In many cases, she barely knew the man with whom she would share a bed. Perhaps they had spoken a few times during the period of betrothal, always with other people present. Perhaps they had exchanged glances at the well or in the market. But real intimacy? Never. The mother had likely given practical instructions in the preceding days. Other women of the family shared advice. But nothing replaces experience. And that first night was a leap into the unknown. She left the feast accompanied by her closest friends, who led her to the nuptial chamber. The groom was taken separately by his companions. The guests continued celebrating outside, but everyone knew what was happening within those walls. The consummation was not just an intimate act, it was the legal fulfillment of the contract. Until that moment, the marriage could technically be annulled. From the first relation, it became irrevocable in most circumstances. Two separate people had become one flesh, in the most literal sense of the biblical expression. But there was another aspect that today seems strange, even disturbing to modern sensibilities. In some traditions of ancient Israel, the wedding night involved proof of virginity. Deuteronomy describes a scenario where the husband, after the first night, accuses the wife of not having been a virgin when she married. The young woman's parents then present evidence of her purity, the cloth of the wedding night stained with blood. If the proof was accepted, the husband was fined and lost forever the right to divorce her. If the accusation was confirmed, the consequences for the woman were terrible. Let us not romanticize this. It was a patriarchal system where masculine honor was directly linked to feminine purity. The woman carried a disproportionate weight of expectations and risks. A false accusation could destroy her life, even if she were later proven innocent. At the same time, it is important to understand the context. In a society without DNA tests, where inheritance and lineage determined rights over land and property, certainty about paternity had enormous economic and social consequences. The bride's virginity was seen as a guarantee that the children born would be legitimately the husband's. This does not justify the pressure placed on women, it only explains why that culture developed such practices. The wedding night also had a deep spiritual dimension. In Hebrew thought, the physical union between husband and wife reflected greater truths about covenant, fidelity, and creation. Genesis affirms that man and woman become one flesh. It was not just a metaphor, it was a description of spiritual reality manifest through the physical act. The prophets used this image repeatedly. Isaiah described God's joy over Israel as the joy of a bridegroom over a bride. Hosea literally lived a difficult marriage to illustrate God's love for his unfaithful people. The Song of Solomon celebrates the love between man and woman in language so passionate that some scholars questioned whether it should be in the Bible. Marriage was not just a social institution, it was an icon of the relationship between creator and creation. When the night ended, real life began, and this life had very specific contours in biblical culture. The wife completely left her family of origin. She moved to the husband's house, which generally meant living under the same roof as in-laws, brothers-in-law, and their wives. Privacy was a rare luxury. Conflicts between daughters-in-law and mothers-in-law were common, as several biblical stories illustrate. The husband assumed formal responsibilities. Exodus lists 3 fundamental obligations: to provide food, to provide clothing, and to maintain conjugal relations. If he failed in any of these areas, the wife had a legal basis for divorce. These were not just vague expectations, they were rights guaranteed by contract. The wife, in turn, managed the domestic functioning. Proverbs describes the virtuous woman as someone who rises while it is yet night, distributes tasks to the servants, negotiates the purchase of fields, produces fabrics for sale. She was not a passive or decorative figure. She was the manager of a complex economic unit. Children were expected. More than expected, they were the central objective of marriage. A wife who could not conceive faced immense social pressure. Rachel said to Jacob, "Give me children, or else I die." It was not exaggerated drama. It was a genuine expression of the despair of a woman whose social identity depended on motherhood. In extreme cases of prolonged infertility, the wife could offer her servant as a concubine to bear children in her name. Sarah did this with Hagar, Rachel with Bilhah, Leah with Zilpah. The system seems strange today, but it responded to the practical needs of that time: family continuity, care in old age, preservation of inheritance. And what about divorce? It existed, but with specific rules. Deuteronomy allowed a man to issue a bill of divorcement if he found in his wife some indecency. Generations of rabbis debated the exact meaning of this phrase. The school of Shammai interpreted it restrictively. Only sexual infidelity justified divorce. The school of Hillel was more liberal. Even burning dinner could be a reason. Jesus was questioned directly about this. His answer pointed back to the beginning. What God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. Divorce was not part of the original plan. Moses allowed it because of the hardness of human hearts. It was a concession, not an ideal. In practice, divorce was much easier for men than for women. The husband could initiate the process for practically any reason. The wife had much more limited options. Abandonment, refusal of support, or extreme cruelty could provide a basis for her to seek separation through a religious tribunal, but the process was arduous. A divorced woman or a widow without adult children faced a precarious situation. Without a husband to provide, without children to support, she depended on the charity of relatives or the community. The Book of Ruth shows this reality. Naomi and Ruth, both widows, faced real poverty. The solution came through another mechanism of the ancient matrimonial system, the levirate marriage. When a man died without leaving children, his brother had an obligation to marry the widow and raise up offspring in the name of the deceased. It was not a choice. It was a duty. The firstborn son would be legally considered the son of the dead brother, inheriting his name and property. This custom explains the story of Tamar in Genesis. Married to Er, who died without children, she was given to Onan, his brother. When Onan also died, Judah promised his third son but did not fulfill it. Tamar, abandoned in social limbo, took drastic measures to ensure her rights. The biblical marriage system was not simple. It was not fair by modern standards. But it had a consistent internal logic, developed over centuries to meet the needs of an agrarian society based on clans and lineages, and within this system, something surprising happened regularly. Love. Isaac loved Rebekah and was comforted after his mother's death. Jacob loved Rachel from the moment he saw her at the well. Elkanah loved Hannah deeply, even though she was barren. The Song of Solomon overflows with passion between two lovers. Behold, thou art fair, my love. Behold, thou art fair. Love was not a prerequisite for marriage, but it frequently became its most precious fruit. Two people united by the decision of others, living together day after day, facing difficulties side by side, raising children, building memories. Over time, the cold contract transformed into a living bond. Perhaps there is wisdom in this that modern culture discarded too quickly. We base marriage on feeling, and when the feeling weakens, we consider the union a failure. They based marriage on commitment and let the feeling grow within that secure structure. I am not defending forced arranged marriages. I am observing that built love can be as real as instant love, sometimes more lasting. Biblical marriage also carried cosmic weight. It was not just the union of two individuals, it was participation in the creative purpose of God. Be fruitful and multiply was the first command given to humanity. Marriage was the context where this command was fulfilled. Each new family represented the continuity of the covenant. The children of Abraham would become a nation as numerous as the stars of heaven. The lineage of David would eventually produce the Messiah. Specific marriages had a place in the great plan of redemption. For this reason, the Bible records genealogies that seem tedious to modern readers. Each name represents a marriage. Each marriage represents continuity. The history of salvation advances through families, and when the New Testament wants to explain the relationship between Christ and the church, what image does it choose? Marriage. Paul writes to the Ephesians, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it." The relationship between the divine bridegroom and the redeemed bride becomes the model for all human marriage. The apocalypse culminates in a marriage supper. The Lamb meets his bride. The covenant is completed. What began in Eden with a man and a woman ends in the New Jerusalem with eternal celebration. Thousands of years have passed. Contracts on parchment became certificates in registries. The mohar became a gold ring. The procession with torches became the entrance into the church with a wedding march. But something remained untouched, the idea that marriage is not just about two hearts, but about a covenant before something greater. When Jesus chose his first public appearance at a wedding in Cana, it was no coincidence. He was saying that the union between man and woman carries eternal weight. He was blessing with his presence the institution that would serve as an image of his own love for humanity. Today you can marry for love, choose your spouse, plan every detail of the ceremony. The rules have changed, expectations have changed. The pressure regarding virginity and purity has diminished in many cultures. Women have gained rights that their ancestors could not imagine. But the invitation remains the same as that which echoed in the hills of Judea 3 millennia ago. To leave father and mother, to cleave to the other, to become one flesh, not as an obligation imposed by families, but as a covenant chosen before God and the community. Biblical marriage, with all its practices strange to modern eyes, teaches us something we have perhaps forgotten. Marriage was never primarily about finding the perfect person who completes us. It was about two imperfect people building something greater than themselves. It was about commitment that precedes feeling. It was about a covenant that sustains love even when the initial passion cools. On that wedding night 3,000 years ago, when a nervous young woman entered the room with a man she barely knew, she was not just beginning a marriage, she was participating in something eternal.